Hey class, in today's video we're going to talk about Wittgenstein's lecture on ethics. This lecture was given in 1929 at Cambridge University to a student group on campus called the Heretics. And I think it's important to know something about the audience to which he was speaking to explain some of the things that he said. As you could probably guess from the name, this group was somewhat irreverent and congratulated themselves on their irreverence. They congratulated themselves on their enlightened moral laxity and looked down upon people who were, you might say, more serious or more rigorous in their ethical considerations. And you should keep this in mind when you're reading the essay, because when Wittgenstein makes comments to the effect that I would never consider mocking moral seriousness or ethical reflection, he's essentially challenging his audience to be better people and to not laugh at these things that are, in fact, from Wittgenstein's point of view, supremely important. So, with that as background, let's look at the essay itself. He begins by telling his audience what he will not do. Right? One of the things that he will not do is give a lecture about logic, which is what his audience expected, since Wittgenstein was famous as a philosopher of logic, given the Tractatus and all of that. Why doesn't Wittgenstein want to talk about logic? Because he thinks in an hour-long lecture, you could only give one the most superficial presentation of the topic and would not produce real understanding. Instead, the most he could produce in an hour is an imitation of understanding, or the illusion in the audience that they understand something that they in fact don't, which, if you think about it, is a form of lying or trickery. I always think here when I'm reading this essay and these comments about TED Talks, because I think what Wittgenstein has in mind 100 years ahead of his schedule is that TED Talks are awful, because they are the kind of informal pseudoscientific lecture that gives you the impression that you understand something when in fact you don't. And if you haven't come across TED Talks yet, just wait. Sooner or later, one of your professors will make you watch one in a class. That said, he decides that he's going to talk about ethics instead. But his talk about ethics is going to be informed by his understanding of language, by his understanding of language and logic as laid out in the Tractatus. He begins by talking about what he thinks ethics is. And he quotes a man named Professor Moore, who said that ethics is the general inquiry into what is good. If you're wondering who Professor Moore is, he was a professor at Cambridge at the time that everyone in the audience would have known. And so, according to Professor Moore, ethics is the general inquiry into what is good. Wittgenstein says there's actually a number of sentences or definitions that one could offer of ethics. And of his list of possible definitions of ethics, the one that I like the best is where he says that ethics is about the meaning of life. This is on page 5. He says, I could have said ethics is the inquiry into what is valuable, or into what is important. Or I could have said that ethics is the inquiry into the meaning of life, or into what makes life worth living, or into the right way of living. All of these phrases, he thinks, get at the general idea of what ethics is about. And this leads him to his first point. If ethics is about the good, we have to ask ourselves, in what way do we mean words like good and right and wrong and things like that? And he develops a distinction between two ways of using these evaluative terms, the relative and the absolute way. In the relative way, when I say something is good, I'm saying that it's good for something. If I say this is a good hammer or this is a good screwdriver, I'm using it in the relative sense that this hammer is well balanced or well weighted, so it's good for pounding nails, or this screwdriver has a nice handle that's easy to turn, the head is shaped correctly, that it fits correctly into the screw, right? That good in the relative sense is relative to some task. So the hammer is good for hammering nails. The screwdriver is good for driving screws. It's good relatively. And he says, when we use words like good and right in this relative sense, it's fairly easy to understand because we can always translate them into a more direct description of facts or state of affairs. If I say this is a good screwdriver, and you say, what do you mean by that? I could say, well, the handle is shaped like this, the head of the screwdriver is shaped like that, the metal has these qualities, and that is why I'm saying it's a good screwdriver. When we use words like good and right and so forth in the relative sense, Wittgenstein thinks that's really just a shorthand description of a state of affairs that we could go and describe more elaborately if we wanted to. But what about in the absolute sense? In that case, there's not really a state of affairs that is being described. So when I say good screwdriver, good hammer, we can boil that down to a state of affairs that we want to describe. But when I just say, this is good, absolutely, this is right, absolutely, then there is no state of affairs that we can boil it down to. He gives an interesting example of playing tennis to distinguish these two uses. Suppose that I could play tennis, and one of you saw me playing and said, well, you play pretty badly. And suppose I answered, I know I'm playing badly, but I don't want to play any better. The other man could only say, oh, well, that's all right then. But suppose that I had told one of you a preposterous lie, an awful lie, and then he came up to me and said, you're behaving like a beast. And then I said, I know I behave badly, but I don't want to behave any better. Someone might say, well, you should behave better. You ought to want to behave better. These absolute judgments of value are what he thinks ethics produces, and he also thinks that these cannot be boiled down to states of affairs or facts in the world. When I say that you ought to behave better or you should be good, I'm not referring to a particular state of affairs in the world. The problem then becomes, well, what are we doing? If you go back to the Tractatus, he thinks that meaningful sentences are pictures of states of affairs in the world. Ethical sentences, like you ought to be good or you ought to behave better, do not picture states of affairs in the world, then there's a sense in which they are meaningless. This does not mean, however, that they are empty. In his view, when we use ethical language, we are making sentences that are, strictly speaking, senseless. But they're not senseless in an empty way. So he says on page 7, about, a little bit in, says, our words, used as we use them in science, are vessels capable only of containing and conveying meaning and sense, natural meanings and sense, states of affairs. Ethics, if it is anything, is supernatural, and our words will only express facts. As a teacup will only hold a teacup full of water, and if I were to pour a gallon over it, it would still only hold a teacup full of water. But think of this image of pouring a gallon of water onto a teacup. The water overflows the teacup. The teacup can't contain it. Right? And so Wittgenstein's point, when he's saying that our ethical claims and ethical propositions are senseless, is not that they are senseless like an empty teacup, that they have no sense. But it's more like the teacup that's overflowing, where there is too much sense. Right? The teacup can't hold the gallon of water. And that's what our ethical propositions are like. They are like a teacup trying to hold a gallon of water, which it can't do. It just overflows and makes a mess. Similarly, just above this, he uses another example, comparing two different kinds of books, so to speak. He says that we can imagine somebody writing a book of all facts. Imagine a book that contains all the facts, all the states of affairs that ever were, ever are, or ever will be in the world. Just a description of all the facts. You can imagine this book is like a giant list. And this list would describe everything, but it wouldn't have any ethical content. It would just describe what happened. He says, now imagine that you could write a book about ethics. Imagine you could write a book that actually expressed ethical judgments in a meaningful way. If you could write such a book, which Wittgenstein thinks you can't, but if you could write such a book, he says, this book, if it really was a book on ethics, would, with an explosion, destroy all the other books in the world because it's too meaningful. It's too powerful. Ethical claims are nonsense, but they're not nonsense because they're empty. They're nonsense because they're too full. They're explosive. They're flooding, overflowing. This is an important point for him that, again, like I mentioned in the other video, a lot of his early readers misunderstood him on. Wittgenstein will then expand this from just ethics to other considerations. On page 8, he, without using the word, talks about metaphysics. He uses the phrase, I wonder at the existence of the world, wondering why things exist or how things exist. Why is there something rather than nothing? Again, he says that's not a question that can be framed or answered sensibly. So it is, strictly speaking, senseless. But again, not because it is empty of meaning, but because there is too much meaning. And our words, our language, which is used just to describe states of affairs in the world, is not big enough or powerful enough to express those meanings. This leads him to his general conclusion. Various categories of language, such as religious language, ethical language, like we've been talking about, metaphysical language, and similar, are senseless. But again, this is really important. Not because they don't have meaning, but because they have too much meaning. And there's a number of things that follow from this. Wittgenstein thinks that this means that we should treat these propositions when someone enunciates them. When someone comes up to you and starts talking about metaphysics or ethics or religion, you should treat that with respect because they are acting out of a common fundamental human urge to raise and attempt to answer these questions. And this is where Wittgenstein says, I would never mock that. I would never criticize that. I would never say anything bad about that urge. However, at the same time, Wittgenstein thinks, while not disrespecting that urge or its expression in language, we should understand that in expressing that in language, one is attempting to do the impossible. And therefore, he thinks one should not argue with these people or debate with these people, but just listen to what they have to say respectfully and move on in that silence that we talked about in the last class. Now this might seem kind of weird, but Wittgenstein's thinking is, look, you can have a scientific debate about states of affairs in the world, and then you can sort out and figure out whose account of those states of affairs are better. But because ethical propositions don't concern themselves with simply states of affairs in the world, but again, concern themselves with this like overflowing of meaning, they're senseless, and because they're senseless, there's no point in entering into a debate about it. So a few decades down the road, there'll be a radio debate in England about whether or not God exists. And there's on the debate, they have, a priest arguing that you can, for the existence of God, and then someone else, I think it may have been Bertrand Russell, arguing against the existence of God. And when people asked Wittgenstein what he thought about this, he was very conflicted, because on the one hand, he thought that, in a sense, the priest was right that God exists, but he thought that he was wrong to try to prove it and try to argue for it philosophically. And that as soon as you start doing that, you are inevitably going to lose the argument because your proposition is, strictly speaking, senseless. It's the overflowing teacup. The overflowing teacup is always going to look like a sloppy, incoherent mess and therefore lose the argument. This is where we come back to Wittgenstein's idea of silence. And he ends this essay almost in the same way that he ends the Tractatus, with a respectful silence around these things. Thinks that you should mull this over in your heart and appreciate these sorts of experiences or these sorts of feelings without trying to express them in scientific or philosophical language. And with that, I will close it up.